finally, it seemed like we're now almost 2 months into the offseason, and it just seemed like he wasn't going to get a deal. There was debate that maybe he'd just signed the qualifying offer, which for as good of a year he's had over the last couple of years was a little bit concerning, but finally he signs a deal, ends up signing for 3 years, $48 million. I will get your thoughts first, Gabe. How did you feel about the PJ Washington deal with him going back to Charlotte?
He was in a really weird spot in that roster just because of kind of the other moves they made over the offseason. There was a forward spot that I think was pretty open there because, they had like the Miles Bridges situation was so weird. We didn't really know if he was coming back or not, but then he did end up coming back. So it's like, okay, that's one high level forward who's probably the second best player on the roster. And then you have a guy who you just drafted in Brandon Miller, who you probably expect to play a forward position. So then with those two now being there, it did kind of leave PJ Washington in that spot where I don't know if he's really our long-term 3 or 4. But then when you look at the 5 position, it's like, is PJ Washington the guy you want as your long-term 5? I don't think he has that kind of skill set to do that full time, especially with the rise of Mark Williams, with Nick Richards looking as a solid backup for them during the second half of last season. Those guys look more well-suited to really improve that defense and hold down that 5 position for them long-term. So where that really leaves PJ Washington is as a backup. So at that point, I really see why it took so long to get a deal done because he probably thinks, I had a good season. I could be a more impact player. But for the way their roster is built and what they need, I feel like he didn't have the best fit there. Now, when there ended up not really being anything else out there for him, obviously he didn't get a deal until this late in the offseason. It makes sense they say, even if you're going to come off our bench, it makes perfect sense for us to just bring you back on whatever we can. We'll just give you this deal. And you'll be here for the foreseeable future. Because it's not like anybody was out there overpaying him. It's not like something where they had to match like some $80 million deal or something like super crazy. At the end of the day, I think it's a fine move for Charlotte. I think they could definitely be better than they were last year. They were that top 3 pick level team. So going into next year, they could really see themselves back in that kind of play-in level team. I don't know if they're to the playoffs just yet, but it just really adds to a decently talented core, and I'm pretty interested to see what they do because there's a lot of question marks around them, but also a lot of exciting things.
How you mentioned like their roster is pretty talented for a team that was just picking second in the draft is like it's very telling. Like they have a lot of like very quality NBA players on that team. As far as like re-signing PJ Washington, I think it was a W move for that value because he was underratedly pretty solid for them last season, pretty good actually, for what he brings to the table. We know what we're getting from PJ Washington at this point in his career. Did take a long time to get him re-signed, but I think if Miles Bridges, like for instance, comes back in that year off, really, maybe Henderson, maybe he regresses a little bit. You'll have PJ Washington, who I think will be able to just plug and play. Whether he's coming off the bench or he's starting, I think he's still going to provide that same level of basketball that he's been playing over the past couple seasons. I'm excited to see the team, man. A full year of Mark Williams being the full-time 5. Hopefully LaMelo and his ankles can hold up because last season was just a big issue for him. It happened like I think 2 or 3 different times where he hurt his ankle. So hopefully he can stay healthy there. Brandon Miller coming in as a second pick. Like there's so much talent on this roster. And they should be able to be competitive and potentially push for that play-in, I think. Even though the Eastern Conference is tougher, I think that they're one of those teams that could probably surprise some people.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an argument for that. They are only a season removed from being a 43-win team. So this is a team that could surprise a lot of people with now adding Brandon Miller, with PJ Washington back, with Miles Bridges back after missing the year, who was their leading scorer in that 43-win season, even though LaMelo does get a lot of the credit because he was in that all-star conversation where Miles Bridges was nowhere near that. So that's something that has to be looked at. But when you consider PJ Washington, obviously you mentioned it, Gabe, there is a lot of forwards now heading into next season. But the good thing is with PJ Washington is, one, he can play time at the 4 or at the 5. He's done it plenty of times throughout his career. And like you mentioned, Gabe, you probably don't want him to be a full-time 5. But there might be nights where teams have a smaller 5 and you want to run him more at the 5 as opposed to Mark Williams. You might want to close some games with him at the 5 and then Bridges at the 4 and Brandon Miller at the 3, depending on the matchup. Gives you a little bit more spacing on the offensive end. So it gives them a lot of versatility, and there's a lot of different ways that PJ Washington can get in the lineup. It doesn't just have to be Miles Bridges is off the floor, so now we bring him in. So it still allows him to have significant enough role to be worth paying over $15 million a year. The other thing is that Miles Bridges is still only guaranteed to be a Hornet for one more season. So there's very strong likelihood that a year's time comes by and Miles Bridges is back and PJ is a good trade piece, or Miles Bridges walks and PJ Washington is now your starting four again. So this gives them a little bit more flexibility and a little bit more assurance in that spot going forward, so that they don't go into next year and they just have the possibility of having nothing at power forward if Miles Bridges does indeed walk. Because after that, I mean, Gordon Hayward's not even on your team next year. He's entering the last year of his deal as well. So gives them a little bit more depth for this year, of course, but even moving forward as a team that is still very much looking forward to the future, evidently, as they just did pick number 2 overall. This gives them a little bit more options moving forward with that, and a guy who's still very young with PJ Washington. So for this year and beyond, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think the price tag's good, and I think he's only going to continue to improve and be impactful for Charlotte.
So I guess going off of that, and especially with their forward depth, a player who I'm not really seeing a lot of traction on right now, did Kelly Oubre ever get a new contract?
He has not been signed by anyone.
That's
He's an
something that was
unrestricted free
very
agent,
surprising. That's something that was very surprising to me. I wanted to double check and confirm that. But yeah, as far as I knew, like Kelly Oubre, he averaged 20 points for this Charlotte Hornets team last year. Now, was it efficient? No, it was not efficient. But you cannot tell me that Kelly Oubre is not a talented player. Now, with all of this forward depth, with Gordon Hayward there for another year, with PJ Washington now re-signed, and with Miles Bridges coming back, and then the pick they made in Brandon Miller, they essentially had signed 3 forwards to new contracts, right? Or at least brought Miles Bridges back. So I'm going to just say new contract, regardless of how the situation was. But 3 forwards in the door or staying along for longer. What do you think is the future for him? Do you think if it gets to the same thing, because they just did it with PJ Washington, where it's like, oh, you could leave, but nobody else really gave you a big offer, so then we re-signed you for a little bit less. Now that we're this deep and Kelly Oubre doesn't have a contract, do you see them just throwing him something small and just saying, why not? We could have some use for you, maybe play a little bit of time at even the 2 or something, or just be there for minutes for depth for something, because right now, I mean, he's not making any money.
I would say probably not, to be honest, because my thinking is, even though Kelly had his best season of his career, scoring wise, it doesn't make sense just drafting Brandon Miller. Do you want to bring in another wing player that will take touches away from him, maybe take minutes away from him? I would not want to. I would want to see my number 2 overall pick have as much opportunity early on to prove himself and to get those reps. So I don't think it makes much sense really for both parties, because I'm sure Kelly, he's probably waiting this long because he's like, I just averaged 20 points per game. Why would I take a lesser deal when I just had a career year? So I would expect maybe a team that's looking to compete for a championship or needs some wing depth to really go after him maybe once we get closer to training camp and stuff. But I don't see him going back to Charlotte.
Yeah, I don't see him going back there either. I'd assume at this point he's waiting out for one of the few teams that haven't used their mid-level exception yet to give him a little bit of that pie, because otherwise he's probably just getting vet minimums at this point. And like you guys have said, I mean, he's coming off a 20-point per game season. He was probably expecting a lot better than vet minimums going into this offseason, and understandably so. So I think, like you said, Tyrik, as far as Brandon Miller being in there, it doesn't make sense to have Kelly coming back. Even when you consider the fact that Kelly Oubre played a lot of time at the 2 last year, I'd rather just give Nick Smith Jr. those minutes at this point, because I think he's a good talent for them as well going into next year, as another valuable rookie for them. So valuable season for them last year, especially in a year where they needed his scoring as much as LaMelo was in and out of the lineup. But now that Miles Bridges is back, now that PJ Washington is back on his new deal, you bring in Brandon Miller, you bring in Nick Smith Jr., there's just a lot of guys in and around his position, in his role, that are going to do similar things that they would rather prioritize their development on. Although I say that while Steve Clifford is their head coach, but even still, they should be prioritizing that young development. So I would imagine he's signing somewhere. There's no way he doesn't, but I don't see him back in Charlotte.
Yeah, Steve Clifford almost has no choice but to give young guys minutes, because there's no Mason Plumlees on the roster. There's no Cody Zellers. All those vets that he would used to give those minutes to, most of them are gone except for Gordon Hayward. And I guess you want to consider Terry Rozier a vet at this point. I mean, he kind of is on this team. So, just hopefully it is time just to get those young guys those reps. I still think they can be very competitive doing that as long as LaMelo's healthy, because when he's on the court, this is a very, very competitive basketball team, for their standards.
Yeah, overall, they're like one of those teams where I don't really know what my outlook on them is, because while it's like, yeah, they could be competitive, when I look at this Eastern Conference, I feel like there's an argument for almost everybody to be competitive. So, like, I look at the Hornets and I'm like, even with all this talent, I'm like, I feel like there's still probably 11 teams that are better, if you know what I mean. Like, I think most people have a pretty similar, like, top 6 to 8, and I don't even have to get into all those teams, but teams that are kind of sort of on the same tier as them. Like, I think a lot of people expect a big jump out of a team. Like the Magic this year, the Pacers are going to make a pretty significant jump because they finished down there last year. I think pretty much everybody thinks that's like a given. And kind of other teams that are on that level, it makes it hard to really say, oh, like, I think the Hornets could really make like a play-in or playoff push, because for as much talent as they have, it just feels like that's everybody. Like, there's really not that many rosters that I think are that bad. I almost say, like, I feel like I say at least once a week on one of the platforms I'm on, I'm like, dude, I feel like the Wizards have like the worst roster in the NBA. But then it's like, oh, but low key, like, Kyle Kuzma's pretty dang good. Like, Jordan Poole, he could have a really big jump season, and maybe they could have something going there. So it's like literally every single team in this conference, I'm like, I feel like they could be competitive. And so when everybody's competitive, it's like, I don't know how good they're going to be. But like Devin said, they did win 43 games before. So it's like, I guess they're right there with the pack with everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, this comment sums it up perfectly. It's going to be one of those situations, especially for like the 8 through 10 seed, the 9 through 10 seed in the East, who can stay healthy, who can be consistent throughout the entirety of the year, who can have those surprise jumps or surprise production from a rookie or two. That's really what it's going to take at the bottom of the East. And the Hornets are one of those teams where, like we've said, we have seen it, but they're going to be relying on a rookie in Brandon Miller. They might be relying on some extent to another rookie in Nick Smith Jr. They're going to be relying on an all-star who has notoriously had ankle problems in LaMelo Ball. So there's a lot of what ifs there where if all goes well, they could sneak into the play-in tournament. But there is also a lot of scenarios in where it doesn't go well and they're a 12 or a 13 seed next year. So that's going to be the fun with the bottom of the East, but they're going to be a fun team to watch. Hopefully they can stay healthy and remain competitive, but PJ Washington will certainly help them in doing so.